Thank you. It's so brilliant to be here. I did the virtual session last year, and yeah, it's just really lovely to be with humans in a room teaching this stuff. So I'm excited to share with you some of what I know about systems thinking, systems practice, complexity theory, and we are going to be doing a bit of a whistle-stop tour through, you know, some of the foundational ideas of complexity theory and emergence and systems change, and come out with some strategies for systems change. But I'll just give you a bit of an introduction to my background so that you kind of know where I'm coming, how I'm coming to this work as well. So I'm originally from the UK, been living in the US for about 8 years, live in St. Louis in Missouri, in the unceded territory of the Osage people. And I got into system change work because I co-founded something in the UK called the Finance Innovation Lab. And I was working at the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales in their sustainability think tank. And we joined forces with WWF, the conservation organisation, to really just do a bit of an experimental gathering at the moment of the financial crisis in 2008, to bring together different stakeholders from across that system to see if we could have a different kind of conversation about what needed to change for positive social and environmental outcomes. And I co-led that project for 8 years, and we experimented really in kind of, I always think about that, just capturing the energy of the people from across the system who were frustrated with it from the inside and outside of it, to gather them together around things that they wanted to change and support their leadership to do new things that weren't happening without intervention, or that just needed a bit of help in some way, or a bit of funding or a bit of strategy to get off the ground. And I co-led that for about 8 years, and then we span it out and it became an NGO that's still going. And you know, we did things like brought together coalitions of NGOs who were previously competing for airtime and got them aligned around, like, these are the 10 things that need to change, and we lobbied government, for example, or we created a business incubator for business models that could have a social and environmental benefit, or worked with the big four accountancy organisations to look at the future of the audit profession. So we worked with all sorts of different people, and also with the Occupy Wall Street movement, which were kind of camped outside our offices at the time, and taught them about systems thinking and how they could use systems thinking to support their movement strategy work as well. And when I left that project, you know, I was full of kind of the experience of doing it, and wanted to create spaces where people could come together and learn from each other about what they were doing to create systemic change, because my sense was that having done that, it was really difficult, and the most valuable thing was finding like one other person who'd done something slightly similar and sitting down with them and being like, how are you doing as a human being doing this work, and what strategically are you doing, and how are you dealing with this kind of relationship challenge? And so we created the System Sanctuary, which is the project that Tatiana and I, my co-founder from Canada, lead today, which is all about creating a place of sanctuary, so a place where people can kind of unpack the very real challenges of doing system change work and have a real conversation about what it takes to create the conditions for systems change. And so, you know, in short, what we do is we teach and train people on systems practice, and we also create peer learning groups, because we strongly believe in the power of, no one's got the everything figured out here. I can teach you what I know, but you're all bringing what you know as well. And so I think it aligns really well with your concept of fellowship, which is that, you know, if we can create spaces for collective intelligence, then that's where new stuff emerges, or stronger stuff emerges. So yeah, so with that in mind, I'm happy to share with you what I know about systems change, and it's going to be a very short and sweet. We usually teach this over an 8-month period, and there's a whole thing, but we'll have a bit of a dabble in it, and I'll share with you some frameworks that you can take and hopefully have a practice at using today. So here are the slides on the projector. Right, so why are we even having this conversation? What is the problem with our current way of dealing with issues? So we hear in the zeitgeist, you know, this concept that the world has become more complex, that a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, from like climate change to child poverty, to human trafficking and beyond, you know, are complex problems. But our approach to dealing with these problems is we're relying on reductionist ways of thinking. So, and these come from kind of two pillars. One is Greek reductionism, this idea of like separation of mind from matter. And the second is a Newtonian perspective, which means, you know, if we can pull something apart and study the parts in a huge amount of detail, then we're going to understand what's going on. But the problem is that this way of thinking leads us to kind of linear solutions, or this idea of like, you know, control and continuity planning. I'm going to set a 10-year plan, and if we just follow it, we're going to get to this outcome. But we know that things happen, like COVID, or, you know, all sorts of things are happening in our world at the moment, extreme weather conditions, etc., that kind of make this way of thinking irrelevant for certain problems that we're trying to solve. And it also, this way of thinking leads to a kind of concept of silver bullet solutions. Like if we just do this one thing, it's going to change everything. But the sort of idea of complexity is that, you know, we're going to need to work in many places in the system at the same time if we're going to try and create the conditions for change. So we kind of need a different way of thinking about things. And we need to move beyond our current silos. So complexity at its basis is kind of allows us to have some language and a framework and tools to acknowledge the interconnectedness that's all around us. So to know that we are, as humans, intricately connected to nature and reliant on nature. And we are also connected to each other in ways that we probably don't think about on a daily basis. You know, if you gather together your family members in the room, the amount of systems that are also coming into that room, health systems, you know, systems of like inequity that exist in your family system, systems, you know, around economics and gender and, you know, all sorts of things show up. And so we are forever surrounded by this interconnectedness, but we probably just don't think like that all the time. And complexity theory helps us to see this interconnectedness between all of these different realms. It's a direct challenge to this kind of machine metaphor, this idea of like optimization. You know, if we can just get more efficient at doing the things, we're going to have great outcomes. And it uses language like emergence, which we're going to dive into, and self-organization, which we'll touch on, but helps us think about interdependencies and unpredictability and non-linearity. And it tells us that the sum is, you know, the whole is not the sum of its parts, and that really the relationships between all of these things are everything. And so in 1966, Karl Popper, who was a philosopher of science, he characterized two types of problems that can help us think about this. So the first is what we call a clock problem. So he said, you know, there are some problems in which there's a low degree of connection between the problem and the environment in which it operates. So if you imagine you take that clock off the wall, if you're highly skilled at mechanical things, which I am not, but some people are, and you had the book, you know, you could take that clock apart and follow the rules and put it back together and it would still work. So it doesn't matter what colour, you know, what the weather's like, or you know what's going on in the room, that clock's going to work if you just follow the rules. But we also have what we call cloud problems, where there's a high degree of connection between the problem and the environment in which it operates. So cloud problems, you know, like there are many things that cause a sunny day. You know, there are many reasons why suddenly we have a tornado in St. Louis, in part of the country that I live at the moment. And so there is a big connection between the problem and the environment. And so what I would like to do to just give you a moment's pause to think about that is just consider alone for a moment to what extent the problems that you're working on are moving and changing and connected to the environment in which you operate. So just have a think about that on your own, like to what extent the problems that you work on are moving and changing, are connected to their environment, and to what extent they're not, because not all problems are. Let's just have a minute on our own and then we'll have a discussion about it. it's a good segue into the next framework that we want to share with you, which I think some of you may know, but I just want to bring it up again. It's the Stacey Matrix. I don't know to what extent this group have learnt it or not.
We won't have seen, other than
the people that were here
in that format, but when we talk about collective impact, we talk about simple, complicated, and complex problems.
Perfect. Okay, so building on that, as you highlighted, not all problems are complex, so we don't need to, employ all of these tools all the time. And we're not saying these are the only things that we need to learn. We don't want to throw everything out. Sometimes we need to do payroll, right? And that's fine, and it's part of all of our jobs. However, what's useful is to be able to define which of the jobs that we're doing are clock problems and which are cloud problems. And so this framework, which is called the Stacey Matrix, sometimes also called the Cefilin framework. It comes from Wales in the UK. Just wanted to mention that because I'm a quarter Welsh. So anyway, and it helps us to define. So what I would love you to do is to have a look at this framework and think about some of the challenges that you've been working on over the last year, say, and where do you think some of the challenges sit and why? And so if I just explain the different quadrants. So a simple problem is something that can be solved reliably in a kind of step-by-step way. So a good example is a recipe. In theory, if you have a recipe book, if you follow it, what you cook tastes like it should do. Does this ever happen? Not in my experience, but in theory it should. Right, this is simple allegedly, but anyway. Okay, next one is complicated. So this is the kind of problem where it's, where we need experts, right? So there are some things where there are people who have really deep expertise in a certain thing, and we need their brains on that problem. An example being sending a rocket to the moon. And we need engineers, right? And so, we need a very sophisticated solution in this case, but it's not the same as a complex problem. And a complex problem, there are always several valid ways of addressing it. The example is always raising a child. We can all think that we know exactly what we're doing, but actually in reality, there are different ways of approaching it. And we can have two children within a family and parent them supposedly in the same way, and they come out different, because of all the environmental and the genetic factors. So, and then finally chaotic. So this is the context, the environment in which we're operating is too turbulent to come up with a plan. And an example in that case is pin the tail on a donkey, where you are blindfolded and you've got a pin and you're just sort of trying to work out what you're doing, and it's just so chaotic, you don't have any idea. So what we'd love you to do is to just take a piece of paper, and we'll get you a piece of paper if you don't have one. In fact, if we could share pieces of paper, if anyone's got a notebook, I see you have one, maybe just share a bit of paper around, that would be awesome. Thank you. And to just map out really roughly as a draft, as a way of just having a go at this exercise, not perfect, things that you've been working on that are on your to-do list over the last 12 months, which one are simple, complicated, complex and chaotic. So just take a moment to do that. And if you've got any questions, I'll come around. So moving on then, we hear about this concept of systems change as well. So, everything from the World Economic Forum talking about systemic change to, people calling for we need to change the system on Instagram, across the board, it's become more of a thing, right, to say we need to change the system, we need to think more systemically. So in order to do that, we need to understand what we mean when we say system. And I think, a system can be your healthcare system, it can be the economic system, it can be your family system, your neighbourhood. So, but really, a system is something that is made up of interdependent parts that form a unified whole. And the components of it are things like people, resources, services, relationships, values, and perceptions. A system exists in an environment. And a lot of the time what we're trying to do is to try and understand some of the dynamics that are happening within that system. So systems change is a kind of set of methodologies and practices that are designed to try and alter the status quo and focus on underlying structures. So to talk about the things that are not necessarily like on the surface, but the kind of root cause of a problem, or some of the dynamics that exist underneath the system, like values and beliefs and culture and power and things like that often don't get talked about, so that we're able to have a real conversation about what's actually going on. And it can require a radical change in people's attitudes, because, you know, as we've talked about, if you're thinking in a more kind of mechanical way, sometimes this way of thinking gets rejected. But system thinking takes its starting point as the world is complex, and it's designed to illuminate the interconnection between all the different parts of the system. Using this practice involves stakeholders throughout, and that is because we understand that we never see the whole. We might have a view of what's going on, but we can never know everything that's happening in the system, and that's why we need to always bring in a diverse set of people to have a conversation about what's really happening. And we're looking at the structures in the system to try and identify leverage points. So that is what we're talking about when we're talking about systems thinking. And then I'm just going to share with you one other kind of theoretical foundation on which all of this is based, and that's the concept of emergence. And it comes from our theory around complexity.
Can I ask a question before you move on?
Please, yeah.
I want to be clear on the difference between complicated and complex, and what was your distinction, the primary distinction between those two things?
That complex problems are very connected to their environment.
Right.
And a complicated problem is more like something where you really need an expert.
Right.
That's how I always think of it, like an engineer,
Right.
a doctor or something. You know, someone who's very, very, has a deep knowledge,
So
sophisticated.
taking out a tooth from a toothache.
There's a solution.
There's
but
a solution.
in
that
order
we
to
can
do it, there is
identify.
an
Okay.
expert.
So complex is the environment one, because they're really. Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that.
No, that's great. Okay, so finally we're going to talk about this concept of emergence, and the reason why we're going to do that is because it helps to move us towards how do we operationalise all of this? Like, how do we see systems moving and changing over time? Because it can all get a little bit, you know, theoretical, but this is a helpful foundational piece to think about. So I'm going to just introduce the concept, and I'm going to share a framework that will bring it all to life. So just bear with me a moment. So the concept of emergence says this, that patterns that occur at small scales create patterns at the next level. Actually, I'm going to share with this one. So if we imagine ourselves as an individual, and in a nested system. So around us, we exist within many networks or groups. And around that is a kind of systemic level of networks and groups, say, for argument's sake. And around that, there is a kind of cultural level. And of course, this is like a model that somebody's drawn, and it's pretty arbitrary, right? But you can kind of see this concept of like, there's an individual, and then we exist within a group, and a wider group, and a wider group, and then there's a kind of cultural level of norms and values and ways of doing things. And the concept of emergence is saying that, you know, patterns that occur at small scales, at say, for example, the individual level, create patterns at the next level. And signalling and interaction happens between these scales. And so there is an interaction between all of these scales. So why is this important, and why am I talking about this? So what this means in practice is that when people say it can't be done, which is what always happens in systems change, right? And people are overwhelmed by the size of the problem. By using this concept of emergence, we start to see how an individual level change, a change of heart. I'm going to use an example. So my co-founder is vegan, right? Now, whatever you may think about that, you can see how she one day must have had, in fact it was her kids started deciding they were going to be vegan. And she said, oh, maybe I'll be vegan too. And so she changed a kind of habit, you know, she started eating a bit more vegan. And then she kind of suddenly said to herself, I'm going to be vegan. And then that happened to signal and make an impact at a change of conversation. So at the next level up, the network or group level, you can see how she then goes into a room and tells everyone at the restaurant, I'm vegan. People have a different conversation. They're having a conversation about being vegan, whereas they may not have done before. And she might start to change her routine, and other people might start to change their routine. As a result, like, there is a change in resource commitment or influence. Let's say 2 or 3 people at the table then are feeling like, maybe I don't want to eat something in front of her. And so collectively, we're not going to put our money to meat, we'll put our money to the vegetarian option or whatever, right? And then you see at the systems level a change in strategies. You can see how over time this has started to become a thing where companies are saying we need to create more meat alternatives. And you see in the marketplace now there is loads of them, and a change in procedures, a change in resource distribution and availability. I saw a poster on Instagram somewhere that's of a coffee shop that said, you know, we now only give oat milk as our default, and then if you want something else you have to ask for it, and we are the, you know, dairy-free generation. And so there's like a generational shift in the way that people are dealing with this, right? And you know, it could lead to a change in law, but certainly it's starting to impact the culture. And so in a way that 20 years ago or whatever, people would have thought a certain thing about vegan people, now it's become a bit more cool and whatever. And so you see how things do change over time, and they're changing over time all the time. And the more of these examples, I think, that we can understand from our own lives and point to, the more we can convince other people that like things can change, and they do change all the time. And so, would love to invite you to just think for a moment. How have you seen things change over your lifetime? Something where it started perhaps maybe with you, at an individual level, at a group level, systems and cultural. Could be with you, could be with someone that you know. So just have a little bit of a think about that for a second, and then we'll do the same thing. Okay, cool. So I'm going to share with you another framework, because let's just drop some of these things in. You can take them away and find them, apply them to your work. And this helps us think about, based on the idea of emergence and complexity theory, like, how do systems change over time? It's called the Bacana 2 loops, and it comes from Deborah Fries, who's from Boston, super brilliant lady. And I'm going to explain it to you. I'll use an example of, say, the fossil fuel industry, right? Because it's an easy one to use. So if we start on the left-hand side in the top kind of semicircle at the bottom. So human systems are created when a group of people come together to try and solve a problem. So when you look at the start of the healthcare system, the economic system, any system, right, there's always a good reason for doing it in the first place, which is there's a problem, let's solve it. What happens over time is that those systems, if they're successful, become more and more sophisticated and oligopolies. You know, if you're working in a market system, for example, like you get the big 4 banks are the big 4, soccer teams are the big 4, whatever. But either way, I think human systems that are successful end up at a peak where there is a lot of money, power, influence, and they tend to hire people that are like them. They tend to, government organisations are set up that support them. There are markets that support them. Cultural norms support what they're doing. And they have huge amount of power that we should be naming. But these systems don't operate in a vacuum. And so things can happen that disrupt the way that that system is working. So emergence of understanding of climate change is an example where suddenly, many of the systems, frankly, that we were sort of relying on and that were very strong suddenly got called into question. Like the energy system, and innovators pop up. So somebody doing solar energy, somebody doing renewable, wind farm or whatever. And suddenly there's a space where there wasn't before, because there's a crack, for these different ways of doing things based on different values or different business models emerge. And there is an opportunity then for a systems change initiative to gather together those innovators, who are all those dots at the top, and to connect them in networks, and to invest and nourish and create more deepen relationships by building communities of practice, which you will all know lots about as you're in one yourself, sitting here today. So the role of a system change project really there is to kind of name that there is a problem, name there's an alternative way of doing things, start to connect these brilliant people doing brilliant things, create the conditions where they deepen their relationships, their connections, they are building space to have conversation about knowledge sharing and learning together. The idea being that over time we start to create what we call systems of influence. So a system of influence happens when people who were kind of previously seen as outliers to some extent start to have a collective seat at the table, a discussion at policy change, for example, or are genuinely influencing the culture in which they're sitting at, and something that might have seemed quite fringe becomes actually very much part of the conversation. And there's much more to say about this framework that would take ages to talk about, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the other thing to say is there is this role of hospicing. They talk really nicely about this idea of hospicing the old system, that when something that has previously had a lot of power, money and influence then gets disrupted and it's clear that there's a really significant problem with it, there's some fighting to keep things as they are, and we will all feel that resistance as we're trying to create change. And some people's role is to be in that system and to be supporting those people to transition and move from one to the other. And other people might say, well, actually, I'm going to focus my energy on creating the new, a parallel system, we call it, that exists, that could over time become something that we transition from this system to a new one. So, any questions about that framework, or clarifying, probing questions that you have?
Not linear.
Mm-hmm.
Describes a flow.
It's not linear, yeah.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Describes a flow.
Describes a flow, yeah.
An energy flow.
Yeah. And, imperfect as all frameworks are, but I find it helpful when people say, nothing's going to change. Like, we can give examples. Yep.
So we were changing processes and connecting dots.
Right.
Yeah, so creating these pockets of communities of practice can be a really valuable thing to do when you're thinking about creating systemic change. And of course, some of our projects, some of us are just doing our work and we don't need to be creating communities of practice. I sort of make that point as well, right? But it's just worth thinking about it, because I think throughout a career there's quite often a moment where it's really useful to be convened with a group of fellow peers who you can have a conversation with about stuff. So, I'd love you to just think about how you make sense of this framework in the context of your work. So just think about that for a moment and what does this bring up for you? And let's just have a quick discussion about it. All right, let's keep on rolling so we finish on time, and talk about strategy for systems change. Okay, so this can all be very helpful as foundational thinking. And then there's a question of how do we create a strategy for systems change then? Because, what we know from complexity theory and from the idea of healthy ecosystems in nature and things is that, to shift things, we need to be working many places in the system at the same time. And so this framework, and typically when we're doing systems change work, we are. And sometimes it can be a bit difficult for people externally to see and understand all the many things that we're doing. And so this framework is a really useful visual snapshot of what is it that you're actually doing at the moment and how does it contribute to systems change. It's called the power shift model. So we use it to facilitate sense making, to analyse dynamics in the system and identify hurdles and opportunities for the system to transition, to generate ideas about where to intervene and create strategies that are ripe for opportunity. And it allows an understanding of the multiple levels of intervention and interconnection between them. So this is a framework. And I should say it's built on a framework that comes from Giels called transition theory that was made in 2011. And it was, but we added an extra layer to it, which is the deep root system, because we thought that it was missing because it only had the top 3 levels. And as I said, a lot of the work that we were doing acknowledged some of the healing work and the movement building work that also needs to be put into this pie. So I'll just explain how it works. In summary, it says, if you want to try and create the conditions for systems change, it's useful to work in many places in the system at the same time. And at the top, we have the landscape level. So this is the level of narratives, culture, and values. This is where we see strategies like, working with journalists to change the stories that we're telling ourselves about a system, or a Netflix documentary that people watch and it changes the way they perceive everything. Or on a basic level, on a normal sort of project level, this is where you would put the kind of newsletter that you're sending out that is highlighting positive stories that wouldn't exist if you weren't telling people the positive things that were happening of the systems shifting. The next level down is what we call the regime level, and that is all the existing system structures, policies that hold the current system in place. And so this can be markets and government organisations, service providers. And at this level, we see change is often about lobbying for policy change. It's about creating policy change within existing institutions. It's about creating pockets of people who sit within the existing system for them to meet and have a conversation that's not happening in their organisations, a culture that's slightly different. I mean, you might argue this might be one of those things that's kind of saying, like, let's have a conversation about things in a different way. And the next level down is the niche of innovation. So as we saw in the Bacana 2 loops, there is always alternative ways of doing things that exist. Some of them are marginalised, some of them are not resourced or heard. And this is a place where we bring together diverse people who don't normally talk to each other to kind of spread ideas that might spark new ideas about different ways of doing things. Or in a more developed way, we might create an incubator program or even an accelerator program that accelerate positive new innovations or ideas about how to do things in different ways. And then finally, the last level is the deep root system. So this is where we talk about work that is working at the kind of healing level, the grassroots level, the movement level. This is about personal change. So strategies here look like creating circles of collective care in a system. So when we're working on like issues of gender-based violence, for example, which we do, if you don't, if we're not creating a conversation, a trauma-informed conversation about the fact that lots of the workforce faced those traumas themselves, then we're not going to be able to build something shiny and new on top. We need to be real about what's actually happening, the historical context in which we're working, and to be, having a real conversation about that at the same time as we're doing everything else. So these are the kind of different levels at which you can plot your strategies for systems change. And that's what I would love you to do next. So just roughly draw this out, and you can take a flip chart paper. I know that some of you from Parker Pool want to perhaps work together to do your Build Health Challenge project, which might be a good use of time. If you want to work alone, you can. If you would like to work with somebody else, I can help facilitate that happening as well. But just have a go at like mapping this out, drawing out the different levels, and I'll show you the image in a minute, and just mapping out what are your current strategies. So this is all about like, what are you actually doing? So if you're working on a systemic problem around health, you know, to what extent do you have initiatives that are trying to change the stories, the narratives about health in the region? To what extent are you doing work that's trying to change policy or change the way we currently do things? You know, how and in what way are you supporting the emergence of innovation or different ways of doing things? And to what extent are you creating spaces for kind of grassroots movement building, supporting that, healing, and personal change, which we know is necessary to create emergent new change in the system. Any questions about that framework before I ask you to do that exercise?